Bonjour, hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for being with us this afternoon in the face of the threatened snowmageddon, which will hopefully leave us alone for the next several hours. Je m'appelle Jennifer Elric et je suis directrice par intérim de l'Institut d'études canadien de McGill pour 2024-2025 pendant que Daniel Bellon est en congé sabbatique. I would like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It is important to us at McGill to recognize the significance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. We encourage everyone here today to seek out more spaces for learning and understanding the history of these territories. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, or MISC, is the Centre for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events, such as this talk today, on a wide range of topics that are important to Canadians. You can learn more about our work at mcgill.ca/MISC. It is my great pleasure today to welcome all of you to the 2025 BMP lecture entitled The Changing Function of Memorials in Canada from Hot to Cold, Controversial to Neutral, given to us today by Professor Eric Weeks. This lecture is part of the BMP Rotating Lecture Program in Canadian Studies, established in 2013 as a formal partnership among the Canadian Studies programs of McGill University, Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts, and the State University of New York at Plattsburgh. The lectureship is designed to strengthen connections between the programs, share expertise in Canadian studies, and expand audiences and interests in the field. Our speaker today, Eric Weeks, holds a PhD in American Culture Studies from Bowling Green State University and currently teaches courses in American Studies and Canadian Studies at Bridgewater State University. His primary research focuses on the creation and demonstration of identity through various methods, including public memory and the built environment. Other research interests examine beer and beer marketing, as well as the intersections of Canadian and American media and culture. He also has published articles in the International Journal of Canadian Studies and Études Canadiennes. I will now turn it over to Eric. Thank you very much for coming.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you to MISC for hosting this. And as has been said, thank you all again for coming out in the face of the snow that you're all supposed to get. I drive out tonight, and otherwise I think I'd be snowed in. But again, as I've been saying, there's worse cities to be snowed in than Montreal, so 6 1/2 dozen. So this afternoon I'll be discussing memorials and monuments. And just to be forewarned, I might say those two words enough times that they lose all meaning. Nevertheless, I have been studying memorials for years now. I am constantly fascinated by them. One of my favorite things to do when I travel is to keep an eye out for statues, memorials, plaques, historic markers, street and place names, or any other similar additions to our built environment that add layers of meaning. These monuments and forms of commemoration draw me in because you don't just learn something about the past, possibly about an individual or an event, but you're also able to get a better understanding of what that community values in a historical moment, who and what they choose to memorialize in ways that are visible in the public and typically meant to last for years. Now, I come from this interest organically, so to speak. I grew up in Acton, Massachusetts. It's a suburb about 20 miles outside of Boston. I was surrounded by these sorts of markers and memorials. During the Revolutionary era, the Acton townspeople were active in the growing resistance to the British Crown. And of course, this year marks the 250th anniversary of April 19th, 1775, when the British marched out from Boston towards Concord in order to locate and destroy colonial military supplies. They first encountered militiamen in Lexington. After exchanging some shots, the British regulars proceeded on to Concord. In the meantime, though, of course, Paul Revere, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott had been on their midnight ride to warn of the British advance. The result was that by the time the British arrived in Concord, Minutemen from surrounding towns had gathered to meet them, notably at the Old North Bridge. Captain Isaac Davis, who led the contingent from Acton, volunteered his men to lead the way against the British, and thus the force organized a military attack of the Revolutionary War, which Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call the shot heard around the world. Davis was also one of the first killed, so my hometown show has that macabre distinction going for it. But it was in this environment where I grew up, surrounded by all sorts of reminders of this history, from a high school mascot to street names to memorials and monuments all over the place. But it also meant that the town and its undeniable link to early U.S. history was sort of frozen in amber. Not that we lived a sort of recreated colonial era lifestyle, but that so many aspects of the town revolved around this one particular moment in its history. You could say we were celebrating and honoring our biggest claim to fame, but it also had the potential to stifle any additional forms of commemoration, anything that deviated outside this American Revolution framework. One of my neighbors even had a small plaque at their house mounted just below their doorbell, which read, "On this site in 1775, absolutely nothing happened." Just a little rebuttal to that general theme found everywhere. But returning to the primary matter at hand, my main discussion today will examine various Canadian memorials through a framework outlined by Federico, Bellentani, and Mario Panico in their article, The Meanings of Monuments and Memorials Towards a Semiotic Approach. As part of their work, they argue that there are four interrelated meanings and functions of memorials: cognitive, pragmatic, axiological, and emotional. Cognitive applies to the role that monuments may play in displaying and representing a version of history, as well as how much the public knows about the subject of a memorial. Pragmatic is just that. It concerns how the space is actually used by the public. And the remaining two functions Bellentani and Panico outline are even more closely intertwined, that of axiological and emotional. Axiological relates to whether a visitor to a memorial positively or negatively values what the memorial represents, while the emotional function explains just that, the emotional reactions generated by the memorial and what or who it commemorates. As a further layer in which to consider memorials, the authors suggest that monuments could be described as either hot or cold. As they wrote, quote, "In general terms, hot monuments can elicit in users uncomfortable or even traumatic emotions, whereas cold monuments convey meanings that have become widely shared by a large part of users." Memorials to contested or controversial subjects have been in the news in recent years, but this debate is also something that can happen in cycles. This is likely the more traditional or familiar process we can observe, where a monument's social function is changed or altered, becoming hot, as monuments find themselves subject to renewed focus based on external events. In the United States, we saw an example of this after the June 2015 shooting at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, when a white supremacist shot and killed 9 black attendees at a Bible study meeting. The killer had posted pictures online where he posed with racist symbols such as the Confederate flag. And this horrendous act of racial hatred spurred a re-examination of the use and display of Confederate monuments and symbols across the country, with some retailers ending the sale of the flag, and some communities, such as New Orleans, deciding to remove monuments to leaders of the Confederacy. This trend dramatically increased after the August 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, when white supremacists gathered there to protest the city's removal of a Robert E. Lee statue. The rally, where neo-Nazis, KKK members, and other white nationalists marched while displaying Nazi and other racist symbols and flags and chanting racist, homophobic, and Nazi slogans, encountered resistance by counter-protesters, resulting in fights and acts of violence, including vehicular homicide, when one white supremacist drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, injuring dozens and killing one. However, following the events in Charlottesville, an increasing number of Confederate statues and symbols were removed across the United States, as well as a plaque here in Montreal commemorating the spot where a home had once stood in which Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, had stayed in 1867. The plaque was itself a reminder of how monuments and memorials can be used to tell a very specific type of history. So many Confederate memorials, such as this very same Davis plaque, were erected and championed by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, an organization started in 1894 to create, build, and promote the Lost Cause myth. This myth fostered the wildly inaccurate idea that the South seceded from the Union and fought the Civil War not to preserve the system of slavery, that was the main focus, of course, but instead they argued or maintained that was fought for seemingly noble reasons, such as states' rights or a defense against Northern aggression. However, many Confederate statues and memorials, like the plaque to Jefferson Davis, were not built immediately following the Civil War in acts of commemoration to recent events, but in the decades that followed, and in this case, in 1957. More often than not, the creation of these memorials so long after the historical event was motivated primarily to reinforce ideas of white supremacy, having been erected during either the Jim Crow era of the late 19th and early 20th centuries or the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. The statues and memorials, totaling over 700 in more than 30 states and also in completely other countries, were aimed at glorifying the Confederacy's cause and literally cement a physical reminder of white supremacy and a celebration of slavery in cities and towns all across North America. Just as an aside, we've seen this yet again just this past week when Fort Bragg in North Carolina was yet again renamed Fort Bragg. But to show how this idea of legacy and history is just non-existent, the original person who was named after was Braxton Bragg, who was a horrible person, a horrible general, was disliked by his own men, and they only named the fort after him because he was the only general from North Carolina who fought in the Civil War. Like, okay, we got one, boom, let's name it after him. In 2022, 2023, it was renamed Fort Liberty. And then just this past week, the new Secretary of Defense said, we're renaming it Fort Bragg, but they just found someone else, Roland Bragg, who's from Maine, who's a World War II vet. No connection to North Carolina. I think he had been at Fort Bragg during his training. But this idea of, we're naming it after people, we're honoring people. Are you really? Who's being honored here? So once you sort of start to dig at the surface there, the reason gets really tenuous. Anyhow. The public reckoning with its built environment and who and what was being memorialized began to increase on either side of the border as memorials became topics for frequent debate, and with many of those long considered cold moving towards hot. I just want to also highlight the history of the Edward Cornwallis statue, which was removed from a Halifax park in January of 2018 after the Halifax Regional Council voted to remove the statue to storage. The decision came after a renewed focus on Cornwallis's actions during his time as governor of Nova Scotia. Cornwallis founded Halifax in 1749, but he also cruelly issued a bounty for the scalps of Indigenous men, women, and children during that same period. In 1931, the statue was erected, and as historian John Reed has noted, the motivations behind the statue's creation were not necessarily solely to commemorate Cornwallis the person. Instead, it was driven more by a nostalgic sentiment for the British Empire in a post-World War I world, and as a tourist attraction. A key player and source of funding for the statue was Canadian National Railways, which envisioned the statue as being the centerpiece of a park that would be built opposite from the new hotel and rail station in Halifax. According to Reed, for all these reasons, in the end, quote, the ideology that had underpinned the raising of the statue was, in essence, that the establishment of Halifax was a triumph of civilization over savagery, and Cornwallis was the city's courageous founder, end quote. If anything, Cornwallis's mistreatment of native peoples was seen as a good thing, or to be overly gracious to past considerations, rather just the way things had been, and that the basic reality of colonization is that it is not a benign process where all parties emerge unscathed. However, with their vote in 2018, the Halifax Regional Council indicated that this line of thinking no longer had a place in the city's commemorative landscape, that the cognitive function of the memorial had changed, that the atrocities Cornwallis committed against Native people had at last far outweighed any positive things that he may have done, and thus the memorial had to come down. In the United States, as Confederate monuments, statues of Christopher Columbus, and other memorials to white supremacy and colonialism were being removed, so too were other, more well-known statues in Canada facing scrutiny due to the emotional impact they had on the community. The public increasingly viewed the axiological and emotional functions of the memorials as negative, stirring feelings of anger or disgust. As a result, memorials across Canada were defaced, vandalized, or removed outright. Canadians, however, were not only inspired by the actions taking place in the United States, as well as a pushback against the growth of far-right movements in both the US and Canada, but also in response to the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report and a greater acknowledgement of Canada's long mistreatment of Indigenous peoples. Although John A. Macdonald was a father of the Confederation, Canada's first Prime Minister, someone who played a key role in the creation of Canada, he also held absolutely important views towards Indigenous peoples. So, on one hand, Macdonald was instrumental in creating and building the nation of Canada. But on the other hand, he was also responsible for ethnic cleansing and cultural genocide. And over the past few years, there's been greater recognition of his past shameful actions. The cycle of memorials again becoming hot, of generating a negative emotional response in the viewer, would occur once more in the wake of the May 2020 murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer. As a result, protests were held not just across the US, but internationally, demonstrating against police brutality, racism, and social injustice. In every Canadian province and territory, thousands of people gathered, marched, and held vigils and rallies. With greater attention being given to Canada's history of colonialism and the racist legacy of residential schools, little slides right here. Memorials to John A. Macdonald were increasingly defaced, oftentimes with paint, but also with caution tape, rope, signs, or other means of protest. The debate surrounding these sorts of memorials would go from hot to what you can almost consider blazing the following year after the discovery of hundreds of unmarked burial sites of children at a number of residential school sites. It was at this point that we witnessed statues of Macdonald being removed with greater frequency, either through official votes from city councils and municipalities or through citizen-driven acts of protest. Memorials of other individuals who played a role in the creation of the residential school system were similarly vandalized, removed, and more widely reconsidered. With regards to Egerton Ryerson and the university bearing his name, a task force was established to study his life and actions, and ultimately recommended a new name be chosen. Likewise, schools, roads, and even academic awards named after Macdonald were reevaluated and changed, because in the end, all these forms of commemorations have an impact and they matter. Looping back to Bellentani and Panico's framing, as the cognitive awareness grows, as more is learned about the subject matter, especially if it's an increased recognition of racial and social injustice, or a wider acknowledgement of past mistreatment and discrimination, the emotional function embodied by the memorial or monument changes. What may have once been a run-of-the-mill statue or place name, something you might pass by without really taking note of, is now in the spotlight and becomes hot with additional context, something that elicits negative feelings, so much so that a tipping point is reached and a change must take place. I'd also like to rebut one of the usual complaints regarding this process heard on either side of the border, in that removing monuments or changing place names is neither erasing nor revising history. There are a few issues with that sort of claim, of course. No one is erasing, oops, I went too far, sorry. No one is erasing anything or anyone from Canadian history. Let's be clear about that. The simple matter is that we are fully capable of studying and learning about history without statues and memorials. Again, I say this as someone who has studied these things for over a decade. Right? It's my field of research, but we still don't learn about history from them. To alter the memorial landscape in these ways is neither woke, nor is it rewriting history. Instead, it is acknowledging that memorials play an important role in defining a national, regional, and local identity, as well as then displaying that identity in the public sphere. When that message is either hurtful or a gross misrepresentation of a group of people, it must be changed. And in a way, making such a change allows history to more fully be explored rather than erasing anything. It actually demonstrates an increase in historical knowledge and the cognitive function referred to by Bellentani and Panico, serving as evidence that a society is learning even more details about their shared history, with greater attention being given to histories and accounts that may have been ignored or disregarded for far too long. Another response to the removal of monuments is that they should be instead placed in a museum, or that a plaque should be added which can provide additional details and context. But these supposed solutions also miss the point. For starters, many museums do not want to house these memorials. They don't want to be viewed as a storage space for racist or problematic memorials, where all of a nation's troublesome history can almost be swept under the rug or ignored. Not to mention, there are also substantial engineering considerations and questions to take into account. Do they even have the physical space for some of these monuments? Would floors have to be reinforced to support the additional weight of a multi-ton statue? Where would the funding come from for any additional renovations or remodeling? And with regards to adding a plaque, what size would be large enough to fully tell the complex history of an individual, detailing what they did and why a memorial to them is controversial, yet still remains in the public sphere. In addition, consider that a memorial is meant to be prominent and visible. Oftentimes, these larger-than-life-size statues are placed on tall pedestals, further physically dominating the landscape, controlling the narrative being told through the built environment. What sort of plaque could compete with that visual? Where would you place it? How big would it be? Ultimately, no matter how big, it still couldn't counter the size and scope of the memorial itself. How could a 2-foot by 2-foot sign pull a visitor's focus away from this huge memorial? Moreover, to actually engage and interact with the plaque, a visitor would need to get close to the site and proactively, get close to the memorial, engage with the memorial itself. To the contrary, it would be very easy to still see and be impacted by the memorial if you simply walk or drive by without ever even noticing a plaque. And now to this slide. It's also notable that after the statue of Johnny MacDonald was removed from in front of the Victoria, BC City Hall, an act which was intended to be seen as a gesture of reconciliation towards the local Indigenous communities, it was replaced with a plaque that explained why the statue was removed, with language referencing MacDonald's, quote, complex history as both the first Prime Minister of Canada and a leader of violence against Indigenous peoples. However, and you might kind of be able to see it there, the plaque was vandalized within the first 24 hours of its installation, with a large X carved across it. This act of vandalism was clearly motivated by a different emotion, that of someone displeased with the removal of the statue compared to the emotions generated by the statue itself. I now want to change focus slightly and look at how one single monument and commemorative space is able to move back and forth from cold to hot again and again, largely based on its archaeological function as a memorial generating positive feelings and representing values held in high regard by the public. The National War Memorial in Ottawa is specifically located in Confederation Square, close to Parliament Hill, the Rideau Canal, the Fairmont Chateau Laurier, and other iconic landmarks and buildings. Unveiled in May of 1939, the monument is comprised of a granite arch rising 21 meters or 70 feet from the base, surrounded by 2 figures representing peace and freedom. Moving through the archway are 22 bronze figures, most on foot, 2 mounted on horseback, pulling a field artillery piece. The pedestal on which the figures stand bears the years for the First World War on the front and back. In 1982, the years for the Second World War and the Korean War were added to the sides, while in 2014, the years of the Boer War and the war in Afghanistan were added to the sides of the archway. Also in 2014, the words "in service to Canada" in both English and French were installed just under the dates for World War I. Thus, the National War Memorial is an example of a monument that has been transformed from one initially meant to represent veterans of the First World War into a memorial instead recognizing all Canadians who have served their country. The site gained additional significance in the year 2000, when the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was moved from England to Ottawa and situated in front of the memorial. With the addition of the tomb to the memorial site, the National War Memorial thereby became even more central to Canada's sense of commemoration and veneration, and how those ideals would be exhibited in the national capital. The National War Memorial continues to serve as a main site of memory for Canada. Every year, November 11th, the National Act of Remembrance occurs in Confederation Square. Thousands of Canadians attend the event as the Prime Minister, Governor General, and various other government and military officials, as well as representatives from family groups and public organizations, lay wreaths at the base of the pedestal and honor all of Canada's fallen soldiers. After the conclusion of the official ceremony, veterans and regular citizens crowd around the memorial to pay their own respects in what has become a sort of an impromptu tradition where visitors leave their popular lapel pins on the tomb as a personal act of remembrance. Nevertheless, outside of certain days and official ceremonies, the National War Memorial and Confederation Square overall tends to be considered a cold memorial space, not necessarily fading into the background of Ottawa's urban environment, but also not the focus of demonstrations. Some of that could be due to its location and that the site's proximity to Parliament Hill means that protests more often occur there rather than at the memorial. Instead, the memorial became more of a tourist destination and a photo backdrop. This would change after the 2006 Canada Day celebrations, when 3 young men were photographed urinating on the National War Memorial. Their drunken act of disrespect briefly cast a spotlight on the memorial, eliciting a strong reaction from across the nation, as veterans groups, politicians, and general citizens all expressed their outrage. Thus, I contend that the memorial could be considered hot at that moment, but in a different way than we saw with the memorials to John A. MacDonald and others. News articles were published detailing what amounted to the pragmatic function of the memorial. how the public had been treating, or rather mistreating, the location, with one news organization reporting, quote, "Skateboarders and stunt cyclists have also used and abused the site, and veterans complain that amorous encounters have taken place around the granite and bronze memorial." Instead of protesting against what the memorial stood for and represented, the public argued that more should be done to preserve and protect the memorial space and symbolism. This is slightly different than how Bellentani and Panico define a hot memorial, expanding from their approach to demonstrate how a memorial's emotional function is not necessarily derived solely from an opposition to what the memorial represents or the eliciting of uncomfortable and traumatic emotions, but rather it can also include a reinforcement of the dominant public meaning of the memorial in response to acts that run afoul of that message and pre-existing axiological function. As a result of the Canada Day incident, beginning in 2007, 2 members of the military service would stand sentry at the memorial and tomb during the day, beginning about late spring, early summer, and concluding on Remembrance Day. Nevertheless, even with additional focus and attention being given to the National War Memorial for a short time, the site eventually cooled off again. The addition of the ceremonial guards actually turned the memorial into an even greater tourist destination, particularly when the sentries are members of the Canadian Army and wearing their full dress uniforms consisting of a scarlet tunic and bearskin cap. Posing with the 2 sentries standing duty over the tomb of the unknown soldier makes for a fine photo opportunity for many tourists. The actual meaning and message of the memorial and tomb were seemingly no longer the priority for many visitors. On October 22, 2014, a gunman shot and killed Corporal Nathan Cirillo, who was on sentry duty at the tomb. The shooting at the National War Memorial and the gunman's continuation on towards Parliament Hill, entering Centre Block, where he was eventually killed, rattled the nation, and once again moved the memorial site into the hot category, as a site of reverence was turned into one of further trauma. After the shooting, people would visit the memorial to pay tribute to Cirillo and what he literally stood on guard and died for. They left behind flowers, photos, letters, stuffed animals, signs, and other mementos. And a few weeks later, the Remembrance Day ceremonies were attended by many more thousands of people than had typically attended in previous years. Following the shooting, however, the presence of the sentries and the addition of increased measures further changed the National War Memorial in terms of how visitors are able to physically interact with the site. The sentries stand between the tomb and the memorial, with small huts behind them and a rope cordon surrounding them. As a result, the memorial visually appears slightly less approachable than in the past. Visitors are unable to easily get close to the front of the memorial. The presence of the sentries creates a separation in distance, obviously physical, but also on a more emotional level between the observer and the memorial space. Visitors are well aware that they are being watched and oftentimes act accordingly, hesitantly approaching the tomb or not lingering at the site. The National War Memorial and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier would again become hot in January 2022 when some convoy protesters who had traveled to Ottawa to demand the end of COVID restrictions and vaccine mandates gathered in Confederation Square. There were reports of people urinating and drinking beer on and around the tomb, and a video posted online showed a woman dancing on the tomb while yelling and shouting freedom. As a result of the outcry generated by these disrespectful acts captured on video, the City of Ottawa requested fencing be installed around the site to protect it from further desecration. So in a period of less than 2 decades, the National War Memorial and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier went through multiple cycles of moving from a cold site to a hot site. But again, that evolution was based on how the memorials themselves were being treated and how that mistreatment ran counter to the largely positive emotional connection people had to what was being represented. This clearly differs from the memorials to individuals like John A. Macdonald or others, which would become targets for protest and demonstration, primarily due to how those individuals had acted and treated others, and the growing cognitive awareness of that history in the present day. It is worth noting that the statue of Terry Fox, just down Wellington Avenue from Confederation Square and across the street from Parliament Hill, was also caught up in the convoy protests. When protesters placed a Mandate Freedom sign and a pole holding an upside-down Canadian flag under the arms of the statue, the overwhelming response was one of anger. The Terry Fox Foundation released a statement on Twitter contrasting those who were protesting against science and the necessity of vaccines with the actual values and beliefs of Fox. And many Canadians responded to the defacement by making donations to the foundation, again showing how memorials and monuments, who they represent, and what happens to them, can elicit a variety of emotional reactions. I'd like to end by briefly discussing another way that memorials can function pragmatically, but driven by a desire to evoke a certain emotional response. As the COVID-19 pandemic began, face masks were placed on statues all around the world, as seen here on the famous 5 monument in Calgary. Sometimes these were done by private individuals in a sort of guerrilla art or impromptu type of display, and other times by cities, towns, universities, and similar examples of more official efforts. In these instances, the memorials and monuments were used as forms of social commentary and to encourage public health initiatives. These different ways that the public might interact with the monument, whether it's putting a mask on Wayne Gretzky in response to a pandemic, or putting a Raptors jersey on a Toronto area statue in support of the team, to so many other examples, all illustrate the emotional function that memorials can serve. They don't necessarily have to be the focal point for anger or protest, but can be used to demonstrate messages of hope or unity. The idea of permanence, of monuments being something that cannot be changed, altered, or removed, is also central to this entire discussion. Monuments are the products of socio-historical constructions and are thereby not static in their meaning. The message they tell was created in a specific historical moment, but that message can, does, and in fact should change throughout different periods in time. We need to understand that ideologies are conveyed through our built environment in public spaces, but that the public itself deserves, and as we have seen, can assert that they also have a say in what that message might entail. One way to consider this question is to think of your childhood home. Your parents may have displayed pictures of you as a kid on vacation or celebrating a holiday, maybe on the first day of school or after you lost your first tooth. But over the years, did they update the pictures in those frames? Maybe replacing your first day of school picture with one from your high school or college graduation. And eventually, they might replace pictures of you with those of your own children, giving the grandkids the pride of place on the mantle. Not that, I have firsthand experience of this in my own family, of course. But this doesn't mean that your parents have forgotten about you or that they love you any less, but just that times change and we change with them and that nothing really can stay the same forever. When we apply that same line of thought to monuments in our built environment, it becomes easier to understand how and why these memorials and statues must change. They must change, evolve, and sometimes be taken down. Even though they are made from metal and stone, monuments still are living things. They exist in the world all around us. And as society changes and grows, so too must our memorial landscape reflect and express that. Their meaning is not static, and they themselves are ever-changing, even if we don't initially realize that aspect. Does this mean that every monument should be removed or that no memorial subject is ever truly safe for continued commemoration? Of course not, right? But we must contend with the fact that although we do not necessarily learn many specific historical details from memorials, that is what textbooks, classrooms, and the like are for, monuments still tell a story, and too often they honor people whose legacies are too complex to be easily represented merely in bronze and granite. Far too many memorials have been created by the majority to celebrate the majority. How much of a unitary function can a memorial really play if it excludes, ignores, or insults large segments of a population? How can people feel they are part of that society if there's such a physical representation and celebration of their historical oppression and mistreatment? Once a monument is added to the memorial landscape, the intention is for it to remain there. I mean, think about it. History is literally being carved into stone or cast in metal. Or as historian James Lowen argued, quote, "What one generation puts on the landscape thus becomes a force imprisoning the minds of the generations that follow." I saw this growing up in my own hometown, and we can all witness it in our everyday lives. When we walk around campus, drive on streets named after people, passing by all sorts of memorials and monuments, big and small. We see the memorial or statue, but even if we are aware of who or what is being commemorated, we typically have no real idea of the motivating factors behind that initial creation. We often do not know why that memorial was built, or who was able to harness the political, financial, and social capital necessary to make an addition to the memorial landscape. Monuments and memorials are almost inherently cold based on their very composition. Although the sun can warm the surface, bronze, granite, stone, and other materials used in creating memorials don't often evoke a sense of warmth. But as I've discussed, the meaning and message of a memorial can transcend its physical properties and make us reconsider its very function, as well as our continuing and evolving relationship with it. Thank you very much.